All right, welcome back to Bayou Time, remembering Clifford Smith. And I can honestly say I had many occasions over the years to sit down with Mr. Clifford, whether it was in the studio or the old studio, on the news desk before a hurricane, airboat rides, it doesn't matter. We sat down and talked on many occasions. But one such occasion was a one-on-one I did with Mr. Clifford Smith. We talked about a lot of things, but let's start off by talking about his early years. As promised, Mr. Clifford Smith, welcome to One-on-One. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Morton.
I've been trying to track you down. We're going to start off on a light note because every time I've filmed you in the past, and your wife even warned you, sometimes you use adjectives that we can't put on TV because you're very colorful. But your wife even warned you before you came on, and then you told me you watched The Sopranos last night. So that fits in nicely, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Let's go way back to the earliest years you can remember. And I want you to talk about those years and how it set the tone for what you would be doing later on in your life.
Well, of course, I was the youngest of my father's three children. He happened to be 45 years old when I was born, so I was a very young person compared to my parents. But I got along with my father very well. He and I communicated very well, and we liked to do similar things such as hunt and fish and play golf, and I liked the outdoors. So I really grew up kind of in the engineering and surveying business because that's what he had done all of his life. And because of that, I kind of grew up on the land and in the water, particularly of Terrebonne Parish in South Louisiana. So again, it was just a natural, I guess, for me to continue in the educational process into engineering and civil engineering. Although I wasn't a very good student, I did manage to get out of high school in 1953 at Terrebonne High, right down the street. Mm-hmm. And my parents insisted that I go to college, and pretty much insisted that I go to LSU because I had agreed or was interested in studying civil engineering. So again, I was not an outstanding student at LSU, but I managed to get a degree in civil engineering after about 4.5 years. Came back to Houma and began to practice engineering and surveying with my father in 1958.
All right, he said he wasn't a good student. Well, even if he was having fun at LSU, he turned out to be one heck of a civil engineer, of course. Now, we also talked about genetics. I was curious to know if that was something he was just born with, or did his father sort of lead him down that path? Maybe he didn't want to go down that path, but why did he get into that? Listen to what he said. Did you genetically love to do this, or did he put so much into it that you probably saw what he did and maybe fell in love with it?
I think it was both. Honestly, I believe there was probably some genetic heritage, but again, growing up in the area, I just loved, frankly, I didn't realize it at the time, but I loved growing up in Terrebonne. Frankly, loved going to Terrebonne High School. I loved to be able to go hunting and fishing, even in the afternoons after school on some occasions. I loved the outdoors. I loved athletics. I loved golf courses because of the outdoors and what I saw there. And so, but then of course, from the time I was 1 or 2 years old, I was doing that because my father would drag me around with him. Yeah. I was working in a survey crew probably when I was 12 or 13 years old in the swamp and in the marsh. Finally got an education as to what I was doing, theoretically, which was good. So I think it was an evolution for me, like everything almost in my life seems like it was an evolution. Mm-hmm. But I think I had some natural aptitudes. I loved the outdoors. I loved the weather. I loved the conditions. And I really loved the physical conditions of this area. But frankly, in traveling around, I love to see physical conditions all over the world, to tell you the truth. So, but there's no doubt that I inherited a lot of that from my father.
He certainly was an expert on conditions. You could ask him. We'll get to that later on in one of the segments. He knew a lot about the storm's past and was really predicting storm's future. But I also asked him an important question. With all those kids and I was watching them sort of work their way up in certain aspects of the company, and I asked him if that was all by design. Some companies, some people just one day crown their kids as the president or the owner. You made them go through the ranks. Is that what your father did with you?
Oh yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, again, I was at a very young age. In fact, I have a big score on my arm where I cut myself when I was about 11 or 12 years old, cutting right away in a survey crew down on Bayou Terrebonne on a project for my father, on the weekends, as a matter of fact. But you know, Joanne and I have 7 children, and all of our children now have very good educations and a very good aptitude to make a living. But the greatest thing that they have is a work ethic, and I think they inherited some of that from my parents, but particularly from my wife's parents, to tell you the truth. And that's really a blessing, to tell you the truth. I mean, the work ethic has always been, frankly, important to me, but it is obviously been important to my children.
There you have it, a straight answer that we expected from Clifford Smith. Well, you know, growing up, I heard all the stories about Last Island, and during my one-on-one interview with Clifford Smith, I wanted to ask him if all that was true, and I figured he'd probably know. What do you remember most about the early years as far as land? Because even when I first started doing documentaries and I had people telling me, well, Martin, you know, there once was a Last Island that you could drive to, and of course, I never saw that, and kids coming up behind me will never see that, but what was it really like? What was Terrebonne Parish years back?
Well, remember, I was born in 1935, so I never saw a road to Last Island or to Timberlair Island. I've heard stories about that.
But your dad must have passed some stories on.
Well, and we have historical maps, again, in our office, again, because my father really founded the firm in 1913. We have 5 million pieces of paper, maps, field notes, etc. I have never seen a map that shows a road to any of the Barrier Islands, to tell you the truth, but there was obviously a lot of land, particularly down Bayou Terrebonne toward Timberlair Island was probably the closest area I've seen maps of. Of course, in my lifetime, we've lost, again, I think we've lost 400,000 acres of land south of Houma toward the Gulf of Mexico. I do remember going to Last Island when there was a sizable island. I can remember even walking across it. There were camps on Last Island way back in the 40s. Baudouin Point was a famous place, a jumping off place within Lake Pelto that is no longer there. Might be a little shell reef somebody could find if they had a good fathometer. There's no doubt that we've lost a tremendous amount of land. Like I tell you, I think we've lost over 400,000 acres of land south of Houma in my lifetime. And that's, you know, that's a huge amount of land. I figure there's about 1,300,000 acres of surface land, surface area in Terrebonne Parish. That includes open water, includes barrier islands, includes saltwater marsh, includes freshwater marsh, includes swamps, and includes about 300,000 acres of land above the 5-foot contour. But there's no doubt that, again, in the wetland area, the 1 million acres of wetland that we had, we've lost about 400,000 acres of it in my lifetime. All right.
Told you he would know a lot about the land for sure. But one thing he also knew a lot about was politics. He was so involved in the political arena. Everyone came to him for either advice or his blessing. And we talked about that on that one-on-one. You're very interesting. Of course, a lot of people who know you know that already, because you don't just wear the engineering label. You also wear the label as you've made or broken many politicians over the years. And they would all, I've heard it, I can't tell you how many times I've heard somebody come up and say, all right, I'm on the way to see Clifford. And they were running for office. Where did politics come into play here? Obviously, you love it, politics, and it's got to fascinate you or you wouldn't do it. When did you first start loving politics?
Well, I'm not sure I love politics. I've been a keen observer of the political process and of the governmental process. And I frankly felt that that was important, frankly, to my business. It was important to my community. Again, being born and raised here and educated here and raising a family here. My wife is from Terrebonne, so it was easy, of course. It was important. It's almost survival to be interested in what's going on in government, both local government, state government, and federal government. Again, first off, I guess it was the improvements that we needed, the physical infrastructure improvements that are needed in our community to continue to prosper. I was interested in that too, for me to continue to prosper. Again, I was very fortunate and had a lot of opportunities from my parents, but obviously Terrebonne and practically all of my adult life has been almost a boom, except for some time during the 80s. But even then, it was great opportunities. And so knowing what government was doing, knowing that government was spending money for needed infrastructure in the area, and frankly, with my background in engineering, I could have possibly some influence on when infrastructures were built. And then as my background in engineering, I could have some influence in even the designing and construction of some of those infrastructures. And that was important to me. It was important to me that the community thrived. Again, there's a lot of selfish motive, I guess, from my standpoint, but then I always felt that a good school system, a good infrastructure system, a good water system, a good sewer system, a good drainage system, maybe I'm not going to participate in every particular project, but it's going to be of benefit to my community, so that somewhere down the line I would frankly, I and my family and my employees would benefit from that.
All right, we have a lot more of that interview. Just a programming note, during the week we're also going to show you parts of that roast in which the former late governor, Edwin Edwards, also came right here in the studio, in the Lorraine Falls studio. We honored Clifford with a roast, and it was interesting to say the least, and he wasn't a bit worried about what anybody would say or whatever, and it's the way it ought to be. It was fun-loving, and you'll see that during the week. And on that one-on-one program that I had with Mr. Clifford Smith, talked about the building of his company, T. Baker Smith. Company has grown vast amounts since your dad's company. But did you ever fathom that T. Baker Smith and Sons would be T. Baker Smith and Sons and a bunch of other people that have really become family?
No, I really never did. I tell you the truth, again, as I was building the company, again, I finished in '58. My father had one full-time employee, but he was about 65 years old at the time. So I began to get involved, and the only reason, frankly, he had stayed in the engineering business was because of my interest. And I began getting involved in all of the facets of business that he had been involved in for 40 some odd years, but we expanded that. And from about 1958 to about 1962, I believe it was, things really boomed. It seems like in in 82, things like the bottom fell out with the price of oil again. And we suffered, as everybody suffered, through Terrebonne and Lafourche. But somehow or other we've come back now, and frankly with new generations and new thoughts, new ideas, new services. For some of the same old clients, it really is amazing, some of the services we're providing, frankly, out of Terrebonne, out of Louisiana, and even unbelievably, projects we're working on.
What a company has grown into, and of course, his son Kenny heads up that company now, and is still on the map, doing very well. All right, one of the things we also talked about, no secret, that when there was a banquet or a function, when politicians got into that function, either the arena, the hall, wherever it was, they always sought out Clifford Smith. We talked about that. Seen you work a crowd without working the crowd. Now I know that sounds funny to people that are watching, because you see some people, they'll walk in a room, boy, they working every table, and they working and shaking every hand, kissing every baby, and then anyone who observes real hard, which I have in the past, there's Clifford Smith. He's working the room, but he's working it from the perimeter, because people are going to talk to you.
How did you ever pull it off that way, or do you realize that's happening when you walk
No,
around?
I really
Yeah.
don't. I think that's just obviously comes natural to me. I guess I've always liked people. I find, of course, as I grow older, frankly, you change a little bit, and I don't think maybe I'm as outgoing as I used to be as a younger person. But you can, of course, when you talk around and meet people like I do, you can learn a lot from them. And I'm beginning to learn that, you know, sometimes you can start a conversation with somebody and not necessarily tell him everything you know, but you
Right.
can learn everything he knows.
He's right about that. They both learn from each other. The politicians are trying to learn from Clifford at the same time. But what was it like meeting with all those elected officials? And I'm sure his day was packed from engineering stuff and also political stuff. Let's listen in.
We're talking a lot about the political side too, but nowadays, like I said, everybody who comes in this area, there's no doubt that before they are through with their campaign, that they are absolutely going to have a very productive meeting with Clifford Smith. But I want you to go back to the first time that you realized that the political process was coming through your office. Is there one moment that you sat back that you said, wow, that person came see me?
No, I think it was an evolution. Again, as a young person, the first opportunities I had, of course, again, was through my father and his reputation, but to begin to communicate with some of the elected representatives in our community. And again, having the engineering background and engineering education, I thought I had something to contribute to them as to how to develop some of the needed improvements. I can remember a long time ago, Royal Pellegrin from Montague. He had a problem in Montague years ago. They had open ditches, and the ditches were filling up with water, with backing up water from the coast, even, and I'm talking about 45 years ago at least. And how are you going to solve that? How are you going to make the drainage ditches work in Montague as they had worked maybe 10 years before? And of course, I guess I came to the conclusion, well, you dam the canal and you put a pump in because we get 6 inches of rainfall a year and you pump it out. So that was how the first drainage pump station was designed and built in Terrebonne Parish, through that evolution, that the local guy had a political, physical problem in his community, and he needed to solve it. So he happened to turn to me, again, because I was T. Baker's son, I guess, and asked me, hey boy, how would you fix that? And again, I'm talking about, I was at least 20 to 30 years younger than Mr. Pellegrin, and tell me how you would fix that. And you know, I kind of described to him how it wouldn't, and you didn't have to be a Phi Beta Kappa to figure that out, or have a PhD. You know, you dam the canal, you use the old spoil bank as the levee, and you pump it out. And of course, from that, we've developed those projects all over Terrebonne Parish. So it was an evolution.
Evolution, that was a good word, but a pretty good word. You could see the enthusiasm really coming out in that answer. He was building up. He loved that kind of stuff. He was becoming himself during the interview, and that's always the best thing I love to see, is when they start becoming themselves during the interview. And you could tell he was excited. And Royal Pellegrin, quite the power back in the day, so I'm sure it was a little bit intimidating. And on that one-on-one show, we talked about a lot of storms. I want you to really listen to his answers here to see the knowledge this man had about storms in this area.
What storm? I know you've even come on and talked about storms on our shows before the storms hit, but what storm really made you realize that Terrebonne Parish was vulnerable?
Well, again, I go back into, even back to Audrey, which was right after, while I was at LSU. Audrey was a horrible storm, you know, it hit Cameron Parish.
57?
Yes, 57, yeah, just before I finished at LSU. And it was a horrible storm that hit Cameron Parish and drowned hundreds of people and thousands of animals and what have you. And it became evident to me that we were just tremendously vulnerable. And I have attempted to track the different storms along not only the Louisiana coast but the Florida coast, even to the point of going after the storms have hit the coast in some areas and look and see what the damages are. Opal was a horrible storm. Now, Opal, I make a point of being a horrible storm. Opal origin was in the Bay of Campeche, and it came north across the Gulf of Mexico, generally west of Terrebonne. And just as it got, say, 50 to 60 miles off the coast of Louisiana, it took a right turn and it went into the coast at Destin and Pensacola, Florida. I think that could have been a very devastating storm for us, because I think the storm that starts in the south, in the Gulf of Mexico, Bay of Campeche or the Yucatan Straits, and comes due north where we are on the eastern side of the storm, I think those are very critical to us. Lily was a big storm. Of course, Juan was a very unusual storm. Juan was in '85, and it was it was not a powerful storm, but the route of that storm, and it did all kind of crazy things around coastal Louisiana, and it flooded a tremendous part of Terrebonne Parish.
And it sat out there for 3 days.
Yeah, and that was an unusual storm. But you see, that's where hurricanes become so difficult to predict. That's where hurricanes become so difficult to design for, because different storms at different locations can cause different storm tides, different wind conditions, different rainfall, and that's a very difficult thing.
What he was just describing was Lafourche and Grand Isle for Hurricane Ida. And although Hurricane Ida was after this interview with Clifford, I went back to that question, which one was worse, Betsy or Hurricane Andrew?
Argument. I've heard it since Andrew made landfall. I must have heard this argument 250 times. Which one, in your opinion, was worse? And you know what I'm going to ask, Hurricane Betsy or Hurricane Andrew?
Well, they were two different storms. Betsy, I happened to be living in my house for Betsy. The eye of the storm came over Homer, but it had to be a very big eye because it also covered part of Lafourche Parish. At Grand Isle, Betsy was a huge storm at Grand Isle. In Terrebonne, it was not a big storm, again, because most of the wind was out the north, as I recall. We didn't have a lot of water from Betsy. Andrew was and Betsy, if you remember, also came from the east, came across Florida and came across the Gulf of Mexico and kind of hit us a glancing blow, not like an Opal coming from the due south. Andrew was similar. Except Andrew was about probably 100 miles, 150 miles south of Betsy, and went on and hit into Louisiana on the west side of the Chaffalay River,
Morgan City,
which was probably a very good place for us, not only for us, but for all of Louisiana, because there's not a lot of population in that area. Andrew had a tremendous effect on the wetlands south of Homer, had a tremendous effect on the Barry Islands, but had very little damage inside the community. There was a huge storm in 1856 that drowned all kind of people on Last Island. There was a huge storm in 1909 that affected Terrebonne Parish. My father was lost in that storm in 1909. One of my father's uncles drowned in that storm. My grandfather and my father were rescued on Bayou Little Caillou 4 or 5 days after the storm in 1909. There was a huge storm in 26, that affected Terrebonne Parish. A storm that I thought was going to have a tremendous effect on us was Lily. Lily was coming across the Gulf of Mexico again from the south.
Right.
It was south of Eugene Island, and it was forecast to cross Eugene Island as a Category 4 storm. And I have a computer model of what the weather forecasters predicted our area would look like with a Category 4 storm coming basically due north across Eugene Island just south of Morgan City. And it showed all of Terrebonne and all of Lafourche flooded all the way to the Assumption Lafourche line, which is it's a startling graphics. Now, what happened with Lily was it didn't turn more to the east as it was predicted to do 24 hours before, and it went from a Category 4 to a Category 1 storm in 24 hours. So it did have effect on Terrebonne. There was a lot of flooding in Terrebonne, but it's nothing like it would have had if it had continued on its previous predicted course.
A lot of people say it hit the cold water.
Yeah, it hit, and I believe there was a storm the week before. It was, God, I can't remember the
And
name.
Isidore and Lily.
Isidore,
Yeah.
Isidore. And Isidore came across Grand Isle, and he came over as a kind of a Category 1 storm. And again, we were the west of it. But there was a tremendous rainfall in Isidore in our area. And the theory is that that rainfall fell in the marshes and in the bays, and it cooled the water. And as the storm came across toward the inland waters, it lost its heat, and therefore it decreased in capacity.
And we all remember Isidore and Lily. Also, our condolences once again to Miss Joanne and the entire family. Because, you know, we always talk about Clifford, but Miss Joanne was driving the boat, no doubt about it. And she was able to maneuver through all the kids and all the meetings and all the politicians, and she did such a wonderful job at that. You know, as I do a lot when I'm doing these one-on-one programs, and that's why it's so valuable to have these. And a lot of times some people don't want to do the interviews, others are reluctant. Had to prod Clifford a little bit to do the one-on-one, but we got it. And I always get to the part where I ask them about the one word, and I'll set it up in the actual show that we did in the old studio.
Always come to the part of the show, and this one's going to be hard for you because you got many facets that we could use a word to describe you. But if I went to your wife or your kids, or if I sat down with Senator Breaux or Congressman Tozan, if the late Senator Leonard Chabert was still around to put in a word, we'll ask him to put a word in. And how about Cindy, who's worked for you all these years? And I said, all right, I'll put y'all in a room for 5 minutes, and when I walk in, I want one word that describes Clifford Smith. What would you hope that one word would be?
Probably compassionate,
Okay.
I would hope.
I do know that about you. You've given away a lot of money over the years, and you've done it quietly.
Yeah, well, I like to think I give back to the community, and you know, in giving back to the community, there's other ways to give back besides money.
Right.
Matter of fact, I'm reading a book. I'm trying to read a book right now about family wealth, and the author makes the point that when you talk about family wealth, or you're talking about contributions, it's a lot more than just monetary. And so I would hope that in fact, I mean, that's always been my philosophy, I guess. I don't know, I guess I was born with it, that you need to give back. The Lord has been has blessed me in many ways. That was very difficult, frankly, back in the late 50s and early 60s. It was very difficult to build a staff, and it seemed like I spent 20 or 30 years trying to build a staff around the engineering and surveying business.
I want to thank you for coming on One-on-One, but I want to thank you for what you do for the community. You are one of a kind, a unique person. Thank you so much for being on One-on-One today. And you got many years left, so keep on trucking.
Thank you,
All right?
Martin.
Thank you.
And unfortunately, he did have many years left, but that was taped quite a few years earlier. And he did so much for the community. At 86, Clifford Smith passing away. And as I was interviewing a lot of the people who knew him, and Cindy, you know, who worked for him for over 40 years, and Mark Rogers over 40 years, Marshall Falk over 40 years. And I was interviewing them, and, you know, everything I was hearing was that it was just unique. And I guess what sort of scares me is when you meet somebody of his caliber, somebody real knowledgeable, who's also very influential, who can also drive the boat, who can also fix the engine, who could also get in the water and change the prop if he had to. You get where I'm going. When you lose those people, it's a burden, and it takes many more people to replace them. And I've watched the levees, and I've watched the tremendous job that the group of individuals handling the levees now have done. And matter of fact, his sons are both involved in levee projects. But when I watch everything that's done now, a lot of that in the original days was driven by Clifford Smith. And we all know the fight to get Morganza monies and the fight to get federal monies and how that all evolved. And a lot of success to those now that have been able to do it. Kudos, because it was a fight. But when you think about it, when you lose a storyteller, a historian, someone who can actually take you through the parish mentally, and on those airboat rides that I did with Clifford Smith, and they were colorful, trust me, colorful in a lot of ways. He used words that emphasized the problems that we were having, not realizing that we'd have to come back and edit some of those words. And the edit sessions took much longer than the airboat rides. But that was Clifford Smith. What you saw was what you got. And what you heard was what he was thinking. And I'm not sure who said it. It might have been Garrett Graves. He said there would be in a room full of generals and from the Corps of Engineers, the guys with all those stripes, and everybody was, yes, sir, Mr. General, yes, sir, I agree with you. Oh, you're absolutely correct. Then they would get to Clifford, and he would go, no, I don't agree with you, and here's why. And when he would finish explaining, he made his points. He was appointed by both President Clinton and President Bush to be on the Mississippi River Commission. A Democratic president, a Republican president. That sort of tells the story. So we're going to miss Clifford Smith. And you always see in a community who's going to be the next person that steps up and sort of takes that mantle and runs with it. And I'll be curious to see if anyone could ever replace a guy like Clifford Smith. We'll take a break. A lot more in HTV programming. Stay with us.